سلام 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 peaceful, peaceful.
In the name of Allah, the Compassionate, Merciful, it is my pleasure to be with you here today to speak about the Quran. Unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit abbreviated because I have to leave to the airport as soon as we're done here. But actually, my own experience with the Quran is what led me to eventually become a Muslim. And so that is why it takes me, I get great pleasure to speak in particular to non-Muslims about the Quran and try to introduce them to the Quran so that maybe they can share some of the same experiences and the same feelings that I had towards the Quran. So I came from I'm American, a traditional American, I guess, Christian background. And so when I started to read and study about Islam, that was the background that I was coming from. And so there are many aspects of the Quran that affected me in many ways. And one of the first aspects that I think is very important has to do with the preservation of the Quran. Because if we're going to speak about following, if we're going to say that we believe in God and we agree upon the fact that we believe in God, and even if we accept the fact or the concept of revelation from God, and if we want to follow this revelation, one of the first and most important aspects is that we have to have a strong reason to believe that this revelation has actually been preserved from its original source. It does not make any sense, really, to say that I'm going to follow God's revelation when we realize or when we know that what we're holding in our hands perhaps has not been preserved. Or we may have good reason to believe that it hasn't been preserved. So one of the first things that stuck out to me with respect to the Quran has to do with the preservation of the Quran. The Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ for over a period of 23 years. And actually I don't have, well, they have copies of it outside, so you can see the size of it. And so this book was passed on by the Prophet Muhammad to his followers, and it has been preserved minutely since that time to this day. And as a non-Muslim reading about Islam, I was somewhat surprised by how many of the non-Muslims, many of them who were not very polite in their writings to Islam, if I may use a politically correct way of describing their stance, but even they admitted and they accepted the fact that the Quran that we have today is actually the Quran that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. Well, they didn't say that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. It was the Quran that the Prophet Muhammad taught or passed on to his companions over 1400 years ago. And as I said, this was a very significant point with respect to me, because I had actually studied the history of the Bible before that time. And I'm not, obviously, not going to get into the details of that kind of discussion here. But I can just say that the history of the Quran is completely different from the history of the Bible. And from the earliest days, this Quran was known and recognized and preserved. It was not compiled by later councils, some hundreds or 200s or 300 years ago, later, after the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So this is one thing that stood out to me, and as I said, this was of great significance to me, in the sense that, as I said, if we're going to follow something that comes from God, then we have to make sure that what we have is actually that thing that has come from God. And then with respect to the teachings of the Quran also, and what the Quran contains. One of the aspects of the Quran is the fact that throughout the Quran, God is telling human beings to think and to ponder. And the thing that God is calling mankind to in the Quran